Welcome to JAPEC Community Life. We're out here with a Civil War reenactment, and I am with General.
No, Lieutenant Colonel.
Lieutenant Colonel, and he's going to fill us in on a little bit more.
I'm the General's aide-de-camp.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about the Civil War and also your uniform that you're wearing.
Yeah, first of all, the word Civil War is a British term, and it means a war where two people are fighting for control of one society or one government. The British had a lot of those kind of wars, and we've had those kind of wars, but the war between the states was a war that the South did not want to control the North, and did not want to control Washington. The sovereign states wanted to be free. The people that participated as state members of the sovereign state. The war at the time was called the War of Northern Aggression by the Southerners and the War of Southern Rebellion by the Northerners. But the Congress of the United States in the 30s named it the War between the states officially. And so a lot of people don't know that. So that's the official congressional name for it.
So tell me a little bit about how many years have you been doing this?
I've been doing this for about 30 years.
30 years?
Yeah, I'm 79 years old now. I'm really too old for this. I have to portray a much younger man. That's hard to do.
Okay, so back then, let's go back on history. I gather you're a history buff if
Yes.
you're here. So tell me a little bit about how you felt about the Civil War and what took place.
Both of my great-grandfathers were Confederate soldiers. One was a Union soldier on my mother's side from Ohio. The war is misrepresented today. You have to realize today kids, schools aren't teaching history. And the war between the states, slavery was a big part of it, but it was not the whole answer, and it was not. There were 5 Union states: Delaware, West Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, were Union slave states that were in the Union, and they weren't freed until 8 months after Lincoln was assassinated, and the Confederacy no longer existed, and they were only freed with the complete passing of the 13th Amendment, which was on December 18th, 1865. So that the United States was a slave country, like a lot of the countries in the world were. So to claim that the Confederacy was totally over slavery is a misrepresented of the whole fact. Slavery was an issue because the South had plantations that needed a lot of labor, and that labor was, of course, slaves were outlawed from the United States and from being imported in the United States in 1808. But the slave trade in the whole United States was continuing up until the war between the states was over. And what happened, my daddy always put it this way: it's like the pig and the chicken. The few northern states that didn't have any plantations and didn't have any real need, they had Irish and Chinese labor building the railroads and women working sweatshops in New York, but they didn't need field labor like the slaves in the South were fulfilling. And so they didn't have a plantation system. So the pig, the chicken represents the North, and it says to the pig, the Southern pig, we need to get rid of slavery. And the Southern pig says, that's a good idea. And the chicken says, I'll give a dozen eggs if you'll give 5 pounds of ham. And the pig says, wait a minute, whoa, whoa, whoa. A dozen eggs for you is a contribution, but 5 pounds of ham for us is a total commitment. And so they were talking about doing away with an economic system that would have totally made the whole, that would have been a total economic catastrophe, and they had no solution as to how you were going to phase this thing out. And so the communication wasn't too good, and the Southern newspapers called them puritanical hypocrites because they had a lot of institutions that were very defiling to human beings too. And the South called them puritanical hypocrites, and the northern newspapers called the South arrogant aristocrats. And if you study the newspapers at the time, but as far as the war goes, 10% of the people of the South had slaves, 3% owned 90% of the slaves, and most of the soldiers in the war, they couldn't afford a slave if they wanted one. But they were drafted, and like my grandfathers, were drafted into the army by their states. And so, you know, what we do out here is we don't try to romanticize the war because it was a horrible war. We don't try to romanticize slavery at all because it was a bad institution. But there were a lot of things bad in this country. We wiped out a whole civilizations of Indians. You know, we had a 40-year war with the Sioux, and a lot of things that we did in that were not good. But we try to portray the life of the average soldier, and the view of the man in the street in the South was not that we're fighting to defend slavery. We're fighting for our rights, and we don't like Yankee aggression. They don't eat like us, and they don't sound like us, and they think we're ignorant rednecks. And
now, when you spoke about economic, a lot of people don't understand that the impact was dealing with a lot of economic. If you're taking the work from one place to the other.
Right.
Now, you stated earlier that the war wasn't just only about slavery; it was about economics, I assume, too. Correct?
yes.
Okay, so could you elaborate just a little bit more on that?
One of the issues was the railroads that were being built. As you know, the Transcontinental Railroad was going full blast during the war, bring California to the east, and they were building the Continental Railroad. And the South was very much, if you study the issues, against subsidies to the railroads, because the cartels were building those railroads, and they were given 10 miles of property on both sides of the track for miles. They made billions on those things, and they were given monopolies things, and that was a big issue. There were other issues. The one issue that people don't like to hear today is the tariffs. Now, the tariff of 1816 was the first big tariff that the northern industrialists put on the southern agricultural people to make them buy industrial things from the north rather than France and England. And the tariff of 1826 was called the tariff of abominations because it put a 45% tax on goods coming into the South.
So they named it abominations.
Yeah, abominations.
Okay.
And then that didn't do it well enough, and they passed another tariff against the Southern people. That was in 1830, and then 1832 and 1840, and they had the Morrill Act, which was going in 1860, and that was the straw that broke the back. The Morrill Act, and you can look it up yourself.
Okay.
The Morrill Act was a tax that was going to really hit South Carolina. And if you wonder why the war started in South Carolinians were furious about that, because it was going to mean have a tremendous impact on export and import goods from the Carolinas particularly. So tariffs was a big thing. States' rights. The South was primarily Jeffersonian Democrats. And Jeffersonian Democrats believed that there should be strong states, and with the separation of powers, also strong states that would impede the power of a central government.
The Jeffersons.
Jeffersons. Yeah.
So they was like a political group back then.
The Jeffersonian Democrat. Jefferson Davis was a Jeffersonian Democrat.
Okay.
His wife. His second wife, his first wife died, but his second wife, that was General Taylor's daughter, Knox, but his second wife, Verena, her family were from New Orleans. They were Whigs. Now, the Whig Party was the inheritors of federalist notion that there should be a strong central government. The states should just be administrative appendages of that government, and the strong government should be that rule the whole thing. And there should be one government making laws for the whole land and having the power over all the country.
That's what the Whigs.
And that was the Whigs, and they had inherited the Federalists, and then they became the Whigs, and then they became the Republican Party. The Whig Party broke up in the 1850s over the issue of slavery, because there were Southern Whigs and there was no Democrat Party.
There was no, okay.
There was no Democrat Party, no. So the Democrat Party and the reason Lincoln got elected by a minority was the Whig Party broke up, and the part of that party became the Republican Party, and Lincoln joined that party. Okay, and so the South split, and they had so that they split their vote, and Lincoln was elected, and he was a Whig. A Republican who believed in a strong central government and the abrogation of the state's power. And we've seen that finally in its fullest bloom now, where the states have really become just appendages of administrative, and they've lost more and more power. The 10th Amendment was an amendment given to keep the power of the states there, and you've also seen a breakdown of the separation of powers, and it varies back and forth. But you've got some people today say the Supreme Court makes laws. Some people today have said that the President of the United States has become so powerful that he negates Congress, and that Congress is no longer the power that it used to be. And but those are all political arguments. But nevertheless, this was the hot burner this was the hot button during the war between the states. And these issues were debated, and there's worlds of information on it. I mean,
So the Whigs became the Republican Party.
Yes.
And they fought for, let me make sure I got this on, they fought for all the states joining up together, correct?
They fought, the Whigs fought for a strong central government.
Okay.
And the states would be, they wanted more power put into the administrative and Washington Congress rather than in the states being sovereign. Okay, you have to understand the man who wrote the 10 amendments to the Constitution was George Mason. George Mason lived across the Potomac from George Washington, and he fell out with Washington on those amendments, because Washington would not include those amendments in the forming of the Constitution and the adoption of the Constitution, because some people in the states opposed some of the amendments. So he told George Mason, we're going to leave those out. And Mason said, you can't leave them. And they broke out, and Mason never spoke to him again the rest of his life, and they were best friends. They used to have a flag they raised, and they'd go back and forth and talk about these issues. Mason was so mad that he kept his delegation 3 days away from the convention and made everybody wait for him, and he did it on purpose. And Washington assured him that he would push the amendments, but he did not push them the way Mason wanted them, much more strenuous than they are today. But they are in the order they are is in the degree of importance he thought they were. The First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Third Amendment, Fourth, Fifth Amendment, right on down. And of course we've amended the Constitution several other times. Today you have people calling for changes of the Constitution, but they don't want to change it the way it was designed to change. Let's get rid of the Second Amendment. Okay, let's do it.
Okay.
But let's do it. Okay, then have the states vote. Let's do it through the Constitution. Let's put a referendum out. Let every state, and then you ratify it, and it goes through the process. The reason they don't want to go through it because the states won't do it. That people are not ready to change the Second Amendment. Some people are. They think they're more enlightened than others, and some people resent the hell out of that. So we like to think as Southerners we're constitutionalists, and we want to stay constitutionally correct. Okay. At the same time, we recognize the hypocrisy of the victors who have written the history since the Civil War, or the war between the states. Everybody calls it the Civil War. The British won that battle. The British won it. Okay, that's a British term.
So let me ask you this. I'm getting everything that you're saying. A lot of this isn't taught in schools. And what I would like to do, and I'll say this, is probably get you somewhere where we can really harness the knowledge that you have one day and really sit and talk about the history. Because, of course, the amendments, I did not know George Washington and George Mason had issues like that.
Yeah.
And then the history of not only what percentage was because of slavery versus the politicians versus factories and why you needed help. And I feel like a lot should be brought out to it.
Another issue that you'll find interesting is the relationship of the soldiers in the war. Most people do not know that James Longstreet, Lee's second in command and probably the top general in the Confederate Army, was the best friend of Grant. Was roommates at West Point. Gave Grant away at his wedding. Loaned Grant money between wars, and was the first person that Grant went to see at Appomattox after the papers were signed, and appointed him. And Longstreet joined the Republican Party, and because Grant wanted him to, he considered Grant his best friend, and he wrote a paper about him at the end. And fell out with a number of Confederate generals about this, but Grant appointed him to be Customs Director of New Orleans and Adjutant General of Louisiana, and later he was appointed to Ambassador to Turkey. Okay, and Mosby was appointed Ambassador to Hong Kong for 7 years after the war to get him out of. There was a lot of people in the North, including Stanton, that wanted to hang them all. Okay.
Hang them all.
Yeah, wanted to hang Jefferson Davis and Lee and the rest of them, Secretary of War was ready to do all of that. Okay, and of course, it didn't help that Lincoln was assassinated because Lincoln was not one that was vindictive, you know. But there was while Tennessee's Johnson became president after Lincoln's assassination. There was a little while there that a couple of years there that it looked like there may be a lot of retribution. Yeah.
Wow. Well, we appreciate your time as we will do another interview with him as time grows. Are you going to be at the other one? Someone was telling me that there's another event going on.
Yeah, there is. It'll be at Williston. In March, yeah, and it'll be at the big farm up there in Williston.
And it's going to be a whole lot more activities.
Yes, it'll be a lot bigger than this one. Yeah, this is a very small event.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a very small event, and it's
here.
Yeah, it's here, and it would be a small skirmish.
Okay.
Yeah. The event there, the biggest event, the largest event in Florida is at Brooksville at the Boy Scout Reservation. It was 2 weeks ago.
Oh, okay.
And you missed that one, and that was when you should have been there.
And the one coming up will be what, the second biggest or so?
Old Lusty. It'll be Old Lusty, which is a state-sponsored event.
And Lusty was a battle that actually happened. Am I correct?
Yes. It was the bloodiest battle in Florida. We had the bloodiest battle for the participants involved of any battle in the war between the states. About 6,000 Union soldiers came across the state ready to burn all the cities and to burn Tallahassee. You realize that all the capitals in the South were burned except Florida and Texas. Yeah, and Arkansas. The rest of them were all burned, and the South looked like Germany did after World War II. The cities were destroyed, and you know, especially in Georgia and Alabama.
So was it? I'm going to ask you this. I don't know.
Yeah.
Was it ravishing and all kind of stuff that went on when people take a land from somebody, or when they come in and burn their houses?
The Sherman marched from Mississippi, of course, all the way through to Louisiana and then into Georgia, and he fought his way in, and he burned Atlanta, and he burned every town in between Atlanta and Savannah except Madison, Georgia, because the Confederate senator there had been a U.S. senator and knew Sherman's brother, who was the author of the Sherman Anti-Trust Act, that was a senator in Washington for years, and they were best friends. And when the war started, he went to him and they had a little crying session, and he said, "I'm so sorry that I have to go with my state, and we will be enemies." And he said, "I don't want this to happen." And he said, "I'm so sorry." And so he knew William Tecumseh, the brother. Okay, so when Sherman's army came from Atlanta to go across the sea, they ran in this little town named Madison, Georgia. So Joshua Hill rode out. Went out to Sherman, went through the lines and saw the general and said, "Please don't burn my city." I mean, you know, we're friends with your brother. We're really not enemies. And Sherman said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, of course, if they don't shoot at us, we won't.
So next is, why do you think?
And we'll burn the train station, we'll burn your cotton mill, and we'll leave everything else alone. And if it didn't, they would just ravage everything.
So let me ask you this. Why the burning, number one? If you're going to turn around and have to use the land again, well, I mean, I'm just asking, if you're going to use it again, and the same people or different people maybe move in there, why all the destruction?
Well, we believe today that a good Confederate Southerner believes today that Sherman would be a war criminal today, because the war, you have to understand, the war morphed into total war. It started out hardly anyone in the North or the South. If you really read about the war and the people there, hardly anyone in the North and the South, and the business people in the little southern towns and in the Yankee towns, hardly anybody believed it'd be a war that would last over a month. And they were thinking of Mexico, where the armies were 10,000 men. And they didn't think this was going to last any time. They thought there'd be a few skirmishes, and there would be negotiations, and the South would go this way. And these people weren't even worried about it. They really thought. I think Robert E. Lee was one that really understood, and he tried to warn people, and they weren't listening to him. He warned them over and over before the war that this would be a terrible, as it was beginning, when he had to make up his mind to go with Virginia and the South. He warned them that this was going to be a very arduous, very, very bad situation. And people thought, oh, it's not going to be that bad. And they never had any vision that it would go to a 100,000-man army and an 80,000-man army, and there would be 3 days of battle to kill 55,000 men and 150,000 mules and horses, and obliterated the countryside, and the bitterness.
So who actually gave, I mean, I'm sure that's not just the first time people burning things. Who gave that order? Or even thought of just burning while you're going along with, was that a technical thing as far as military back then? Or was that actually something that just...
The burning and living off the land was approved by Washington, by the War Department.
To burn something that you're going to later on have to rebuild.
They wanted to bring, Sherman wanted, and Stanton and Lincoln wanted to bring the war to the people of the South to end it. And they wanted to make it sting, as Sherman said. He called his boys devil boys. And they lived off the land. They had to live off the land. The armies were so big, it took 4 corps for 3 days to get through a little town. The men were, when you were in a town and you were in Georgia and at Sherman's army, you're walking in front of the cameras, Bob.
Well, sorry about that.
when the armies went through Georgia, it was 2 or 3 days before his army passed through. There was that many companies, battalions, and regiments, and I mean, it was a lot of it was not a little thing. It was like a big plague coming through, and they were all living off the land. Okay.
So let me ask you this: I'm sure there were families back then. So they burnt all the houses. They tore the land up.
They said a crow couldn't fly over it in Georgia. Yeah.
So what happened to the families? They killed all of them too?
If you were a man, an able-bodied man, you were liable to be hung. And if you were women, you would be put out in the street and your house would be burned.
So the women, nothing happened to the women? Or did something happen?
There was a lot of going on there. And
wow.
There was a lot of allegations going back and forth. And it was a very bitter thing. It left bitterness that lasts to this day. Sherman's army was a very wild thing going through Georgia, and this started in Mississippi. They went from Sherman and Grant moved from Mississippi River to Jackson, Mississippi, and Sherman did not want to live off the land. He said this won't work, and he made Grant put the order in writing. And Grant told him to get every wagon, every buggy, and everything he could, and they were going to live off the land. Sherman did not think you could do that. By the time they got to Jackson, he had been educated. Grant educated him. Grant was probably the winner of that war.
So
He's a very, very, very intuitive officer. When they got to Jackson, there were still factories. They went into. It was an interesting thing if you read about it. Sherman and Grant got there and they were making tents for the Confederacy and putting CSA on them, and they had women doing all the working in the canvas, and they walked in and watched them working, and they were still running the machines and everything. And finally, Sherman said, okay, it's time to put a stop to this, and he stopped the factory and he told the ladies, okay, we're going to burn your factory. Take anything you want, but if you take it, you can take whatever you want to take, you can take it, because all of it's going to be burned. Some of the women got rolls of canvas and took it with them, and they evacuated the place, and he had his men come in and they burned the factory. And then they burned the whole city.
Why all of the burning? Okay, you joining the union. Let's say you're going to join.
I can answer that question.
Okay, because right now we got tents around us, so me and you go take over. Okay. But eventually we got to rebuild all this stuff.
Yeah.
So why not just get the people out and keep?
They weren't concentrating on rebuilding at the moment. What they were concentrating on was stopping the Southern ability to wage war.
Okay, so you burn everything in the past.
So they had lost eventually 320 to 350,000 men killed, and they weren't in any mood to let anything be saved. Okay, and it's an interesting thing,
if we war today, if you general today, would you have done back then, if you was a general back then, would you have done the same move to cover your tracks?
Yep. Well, we have the only thing I can say is we have to look at what we did in Europe in World War II. We were pretty destructive in Europe in World War II. My uncle was a captain in Patton's army, and we destroyed towns. If the Germans resisted, we shelled the towns, okay, and we put our tanks in the rubble and fought them out of the rubble. If the Germans didn't resist, we went through the town and left it pretty much there. There was atrocities. They weren't sanctioned by the government, by the army, but there were atrocities in World War II. Some of the atrocities in the war between the states were sanctioned. Sherman wanted his men to go out and loot, and he laughed at it, and he called them. If you read about Sherman, he called them devil boys, my devil boys.
So this was their nickname, devil boys.
Devil boys, yeah. And so it built resentment in the South, and you can understand that. There were two sides to the story. The Yankee boys saw those plantations. A lot of the slaves were treated terribly and were very poor, and they said, well, they're getting what they deserve. But a whole system of economic system had evolved over a period of 300 years, and it wasn't a system that was just put in place. I mean, all the slave ships, 90% of the slave ships before the war, before 1808, came out of Boston and Newport, Rhode Island. And Boston, they loaded up with New England rum and shipped. The slave triangle was from Boston to the East Africa, okay, West Africa, and West Africa they traded rum for slaves that had been robbed by other tribes and sold to the Arabs. Okay, we can bring the Arabs into this thing, and they sold the slaves to the rum runners. And they loaded the slaves on the ship after they unloaded the rum and went to Cuba with them, where they were separated with the ones that survived.
Trade some drink.
They were then paired up into families and so forth, and trained to different things to make them a big man like yourself would have been made a blacksmith, and then they would have taught you how to be a blacksmith, and given you a woman, and then you would have been taken to Savannah or to Charleston and put on the block, and they'd have said, "Here's this man. He's a blacksmith. He can do your blacksmith work." And some plantation owner said, "Boy, I need a blacksmith. Woo, I'll take them. She can work in the house and be a cook, and I'll take them, and I'll pay you $3,000 a piece for them." Okay. And that was the slave trade. And then those ships that unloaded slaves in Cuba then loaded up with sugar and took it back to New England. That was the slave trade triangle. But it was New England that was benefiting from the banks that were financing all of that.
So let me ask you this, and then I'll be almost done.
But that ended in 1808. I mean, people don't understand history. The country had started. The world was beginning to change, and the institutions of the world. There were some countries that had slaves long after the United States did. There were some that began to end it before the United States, but we were right in there as European people. We were right in there with the rest of the world. It wasn't this country wasn't different. A lot of people think the United States was different. We had slaves. No, it wasn't different. Everybody had. It was an accepted thing going back way before biblical days, okay?
So let me ask you this. When you brought up the slave trade, the money, you said they trade drinks and sugar, or was it to whomever, I guess they were getting the people from?
They sold.
Who paid the money? Was it back in the States or back in another state? Because I gather, I'm just trying to understand. A ship leaves Boston. It's got drink on it.
It's got rum on it.
Got rum on it.
But barrels of rum, yeah.
And he comes down to Africa and trades with the Africans from the different tribes.
Well,
Where does the money come in?
Basically, probably traded it for merchants who were trading with the indigenous people, probably European or Arabs. A lot of the Arabs were Indian people.
Who actually gave the cash flow? Because at some point, rum became money.
Those merchants actually bought the rum and sold the slave, and then others sold the slaves to them, and they filled the boats full of slavery.
Okay, so I want to make sure I have this straight. We come down from Boston. I got rum. Straight to Africa. When we get from Africa, then we're going to turn around and negotiate with.
We're going to sell our cargo, and then we're going to take the money and load up with slaves.
Okay, that's what I want to know. Okay.
And then we're going to take these poor Africans that were kidnapped from other tribes, the Tutus hitting the Hutus, the tribal people, and they'd go in and take a whole tribe. Or take a whole colony and put them in slavery and take them and generally the Arabs traders were the ones that bought them. Okay. And that was part. If you study the slave, the slave trade, I had race relations at Florida State, and we had to study. I don't know what people are studying today, but if you study that trade, you find out there was a lot of involvement there. And so then they took these slaves to Cuba, and then the Spanish got in on it. Okay, Cuba was run by Spain, and Spain, those people in Cuba and the Cubans and the Spanish had slaves, and they were working the slave trade, okay, and they were preparing those slaves to be sold to make a profit on them, okay. They bought them for a certain amount, and then they enhanced them, and then they sold them, okay, and they were all making profits on the sale. It was chattel. Now, there is an issue that comes up, that the 3/5 law, and that's talked about a lot today. Well, they didn't count the 3/5 of a slave for 3/5 of a person. That's not true at all. The South got in a fight with the North over the amount of people you have. Determined the amount of representatives you had in Congress. So if you had 10,000 slaves, and you could say, well, we have 10,000 people. The South wanted to count them all, and said in their population figures so they would have more representation. The Yankees didn't want them to count slaves at all. So they came to the 3/5 compromise. Was the South finally agreed, okay, we'll count the slaves with 60%, or with 60% of the slaves can be counted as part of the population. And so the issue was not over the worth of a man as counted 3/5. It was over whether you were going to apportion. You were going to give him that much, give the southern state that much apportioning, you give them that kind of voting power. Because if they were to count all of them, then then you would not just get 60%, you'd get 100%. You'd have more people in Congress. You'd have more voting power. So and today I hear that completely twisted around by demagogues to make it sound like it was some kind of prejudicial thing. It had nothing to do. It had everything to do with apportionment and nothing to do with prejudice. Okay, it was strictly. It might be interesting for you to bring up this statistic. People today think that people in those days were